The railroad car shuddered to a halt with a metallic screech that seemed to echo the defeat in Generalmajor Klaus von Steinberg's soul. Through the barred window, he caught his first glimpse of American soil, flat, endless plains stretching toward a horizon that promised nothing but captivity. The October wind of 1943 carried the scent of industrial smoke and something else he couldn't identify. Hope, perhaps, or victory. Neither belonged to him anymore. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Klaus pressed his face against the cool glass, his breath fogging the surface as he watched American soldiers in their clean, well-fitted uniforms escort other German prisoners from the forward cars. Everything about them spoke of abundance. Their equipment gleamed, their boots were unpatched, their faces bore the confident expressions of men who knew they were winning. It was a stark contrast to the ragged Wehrmacht units he'd commanded in North Africa, where every bullet had been precious and every tank a mechanical miracle held together by prayers and ingenuity. "Americana," muttered Hauptmann Friedrich Weber from the bench across the narrow aisle. Weber had lost his left arm at Kasserine Pass and wore his bitterness like a second skin. "Look how fat they are. How can such soft men fight a war?" Klaus didn't answer immediately. His trained eye was cataloging details that Weber missed. The casual efficiency of the guards, the modern rifles they carried, the trucks waiting beyond the platform that looked nothing like the fuel-starved vehicles he'd grown accustomed to in the Africa Corps. These weren't the desperate, under-trained Americans his intelligence reports had described. These were the soldiers of a nation fully mobilized, fully committed, and fully supplied. The train car door opened with a bang, and a young American lieutenant stepped inside. He was tall, perhaps 25, with the kind of clean-shaven face that spoke of regular meals and peaceful nights. When he spoke, his German was adequate, but accented with Midwestern inflections. "Gentlemen, welcome to Camp Perry, Ohio. You will be processed according to the Geneva Convention and treated with the respect due to officers of the German Wehrmacht. I am Lieutenant Morrison, and I will be your liaison during your initial processing." Klaus stood slowly, his back aching from weeks of cramped transport. As the ranking officer among this group of prisoners, protocol demanded he speak for them. "I am Generalmajor Klaus von Steinberg, formerly commanding the 15th Panzer Division. I assume you wish to verify our identities and conduct interrogations?" Lieutenant Morrison consulted a clipboard with practiced ease. "That's correct, General, though I think you'll find our facilities quite comfortable. America believes in treating humans humanely." There was something in his tone, not quite pride, but a quiet confidence that made Klaus's stomach tighten with unease. As they stepped off the train, Klaus was struck by the sheer scale of the operation surrounding them. This wasn't some hastily constructed detention facility. Camp Perry stretched as far as he could see, with neat rows of barracks, administrative buildings, and what appeared to be recreational facilities. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, but they seemed almost decorative compared to the imposing fortifications he was used to seeing. Everything spoke of a nation that could afford to house its enemies in comfort because it had resources to spare. But it was the sound that truly unsettled him. Even here, miles from any major city, he could hear it, a constant, rhythmic hammering that seemed to pulse from the very earth. Industrial noise, manufacturing, the sound of a country at full production. "What is that sound?" he asked Lieutenant Morrison as they walked toward the processing center. The young officer glanced around as if noticing the noise for the first time. "Oh, that? There's a tank factory about 20 miles east of here. Runs 3 shifts, 7 days a week. You get used to it after a while." Klaus stumbled slightly, catching himself on Weber's good arm. A tank factory, running continuously. 20 miles from a prisoner of war camp, as if such industrial capacity was so common that its proximity to enemy prisoners was unremarkable. In his final days in North Africa, Klaus had watched his panzer crews cannibalizing destroyed tanks for spare parts, mixing sand with oil to keep their engines running just a few more kilometers. He'd seen mechanics weep over broken transmission assemblies they couldn't replace, watched as his elite armored division was reduced to fewer than 20 operational vehicles. And here, in the American heartland, tank factories ran around the clock, their production so abundant that the sound was merely background noise. As they entered the processing building, Klaus caught sight of a bulletin board covered with newspaper clippings. Even his limited English was sufficient to understand the headlines. Detroit retool complete. B-24 production doubles. West Coast shipyards ahead of schedule. War bonds drive exceeds goal by 300%. The photographs showed endless assembly lines, workers, many of them women, producing aircraft, ships, and vehicles with industrial precision that made his engineering background rebel against the impossibility of it all. How could a nation mobilize so completely, so efficiently? How could a country that had been at peace less than 2 years ago be outproducing the combined industrial might of Germany, which had been preparing for this war since the mid-1930s? "Sir?" Lieutenant Morrison was waiting patiently by a desk where a sergeant prepared to begin the identification process. Klaus tore his attention away from the bulletin board and approached the desk. The sergeant, middle-aged, competent, with the bearing of a man who had processed hundreds of prisoners with quiet efficiency, looked up with professional courtesy. "Name, rank, and serial number, sir?" "Klaus Friedrich von Steinberg, Generalmajor, Wehrmacht, service number 4471829. The sergeant made neat notations on a form, then consulted what appeared to be a comprehensive dossier. Born Munich, 1902. Graduated Munich Technical University, 1924. Degree in Mechanical Engineering. Commissioned in the Reichswehr, 1925. Served with distinction in Poland and France before assignment to the Afrika Korps in 1941. Captured near Tunis, October 15, 1943, while attempting to coordinate the evacuation of German armored units. The accuracy of the intelligence file was staggering, but Klaus maintained his composure. "That information appears correct." "Excellent. Now, General, you'll be assigned quarters appropriate to your rank. As an officer, you'll have access to our library, recreational facilities, and educational programs. We find that productive activities help maintain morale during what may be an extended stay." Extended stay. The words carried implications that Klaus didn't want to examine too closely. In the early days of the war, prisoner exchanges had been common, repatriation negotiations routine. But something in the sergeant's tone suggested this conflict had moved beyond such civilized accommodations. "How long do you expect this war to continue?" Klaus asked, knowing the question was probably futile, but unable to stop himself. The sergeant and Lieutenant Morrison exchanged glances. Morrison answered carefully. "General, I think that depends largely on decisions made in Berlin. But I can tell you this, America is committed to unconditional surrender. There won't be a negotiated peace this time." Unconditional surrender. The phrase hit Klaus like a physical blow. Not defeat, not strategic withdrawal, not even conditional capitulation. Complete, total surrender. The kind of war aim that nations adopted only when they were certain of absolute victory. As they processed through the final administrative steps, Klaus found himself studying every detail of the American operation with professional interest. The forms were printed on high-quality paper. The typewriters were new, efficient models. The guards' equipment showed no signs of shortages or improvisation. Even the coffee, real coffee, not chicory and grain substitutes that had become standard in Germany, spoke of a supply chain so robust that luxuries were commonplace. Before the war began, Klaus's assigned quarters exceeded anything he had experienced during his final months in North Africa. A private room with a real bed, clean sheets changed weekly, and a desk where he could write letters home, assuming the censors would allow them through. The window looked out over the camp's central quadrangle, where German prisoners moved with the careful dignity of men trying to maintain military bearing despite their circumstances. But it was the view beyond the camp that drew his attention during those first days. The American countryside stretched endlessly, dotted with farms that showed no signs of wartime deprivation. Cattle grazed in pastures that hadn't been requisitioned for military use. Farmhouses displayed electric lights that burned freely without concern for blackout restrictions or fuel shortages. This was a country that could fight a global war without asking its civilian population to sacrifice comfort, much less survival necessities. On his third evening at Camp Perry, Klaus was invited to dine with Colonel James Patterson, the camp commander. Patterson was a career officer in his 50s, a veteran of the Great War, who spoke passable German and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who understood both military efficiency and human psychology. "I hope you're finding the accommodations adequate, General," Patterson said as they were served what appeared to be actual beef, not horse, not suspicious meat of unknown origin, but genuine American beef prepared with vegetables that looked fresh from the garden. "More than adequate, Colonel. I confess I'm somewhat surprised by the generosity of your facilities." Patterson smiled, cutting his steak with deliberate precision. "America has always believed that how we treat our enemies says more about us than about them. But I'll be honest with you, General. We can afford to be generous because this war is going very well for us." There was no boasting in his tone, just a matter-of-fact assessment that carried more weight than any propaganda speech. Klaus had learned to read men in combat, and Patterson radiated the calm certainty of someone who knew the outcome before the final battle was fought. "May I ask your assessment of the strategic situation?" Klaus inquired carefully. "You may ask, and I'll answer within the bounds of operational security." Patterson paused to sip his coffee, again, real coffee that smelled like luxury itself. "General, you're a trained engineer. You understand industrial capacity, logistics, resource allocation. What have you observed since your arrival in America?" Klaus considered his response. Intelligence sharing was forbidden, but analysis of publicly available information fell into a gray area. "I've observed substantial industrial development, manufacturing capacity that seems extensive." "Extensive?" Patterson repeated the word, as if tasting its implications. "General, let me share some numbers that have already been published in our newspapers, so I'm not revealing military secrets. In 1942, American industry produced 48,000 aircraft. This year, we're on track to produce 86,000. Last year, we launched 750 new ships. This year, over 1,200. Klaus's engineering mind recoiled from the numbers. They were impossible. No nation could scale production so rapidly without compromising quality, without experiencing supply bottlenecks, without the kind of resource shortages that had plagued German industry even before the war began. "And tanks," Patterson continued conversationally, "are particularly interesting from a production standpoint. You commanded armor, so you understand the complexity involved in manufacturing a main battle tank. The precision engineering, the specialized metallurgy, the coordination of dozens of suppliers and subcontractors. Indeed, tank production requires substantial industrial infrastructure and skilled labor. In Germany, We found that maintaining production quotas while ensuring quality control presented constant challenges. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. Would you care to hazard a guess at American tank production last year? Klaus considered what he knew of American industry before the war, made calculations based on observed mobilization efforts, and applied his understanding of manufacturing limitations. Perhaps 5,000 units, allowing for the challenges of retooling civilian production lines and training workers in specialized techniques? 24,997 tanks and self-propelled guns. Patterson delivered the number with quiet emphasis. Not 5,000, nearly 25,000. And this year, we're projected to exceed 29,000. The fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against his plate. 29,000 tanks in a single year. His entire Panzer Division had fielded fewer than 200 operational vehicles at its peak strength. The numbers represented an industrial capacity so vast that his experience provided no framework for understanding them. Klaus struggled to find words. That's impossible. The steel requirements alone would exhaust any nation's resources. The machine tools, the skilled labor, the rubber for tracks, the specialized components. Would you like to know how we're managing the rubber shortage? We've developed synthetic rubber production. 13 plants, producing 400,000 tons per year. We've turned the rubber shortage into a strategic vulnerability into a production advantage.
Klaus sat in silence, his mind racing through implications that seemed to multiply with each new piece of information. Synthetic rubber production at that scale required chemical engineering expertise, industrial capacity, and resource allocation that suggested American war mobilization was operating on principles he didn't understand. This wasn't simply a matter of quantity over quality. This was systematic, comprehensive industrial supremacy. How? The word escaped before he could stop it. Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Klaus with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. How is America producing at these levels? The answer is complex, but it starts with something Germany never understood about this country. We're not fighting this war despite our industrial capacity. We're fighting this war because of our industrial capacity. I don't understand the distinction. Germany converted its peacetime economy to wartime production. America expanded its peacetime economy and then added wartime production on top of it. We didn't sacrifice civilian manufacturing to build military equipment. We built new factories, trained new workers, developed new supply chains. American civilians are eating better today than they were before the war began, while simultaneously producing more military equipment than any nation in history. Klaus felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're suggesting that America has achieved total war mobilization without requiring total war sacrifice. I'm not suggesting it, General. I'm stating it as fact. American automobile production converted to tank production, but we also built new automobile factories to replace civilian demand. American shipyards expanded to build Liberty ships, but we also constructed new civilian shipping capacity. We didn't rob Peter to pay Paul. We hired Peter's brother and Paul's cousin and put them all to work. The implications were staggering. Klaus had spent the war watching German industry cannibalize itself, watching civilian production disappear as resources shifted to military needs, watching supply chains collapse under the strain of total war mobilization. The idea of a country that could expand both civilian and military production simultaneously challenged every assumption about wartime economics he'd ever held. The unemployment problem, Klaus said suddenly, understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. In 1939, America had 9 million unemployed workers. Today, we have labor shortages. We didn't just mobilize our existing industrial capacity, we mobilized our unused human resources. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rural workers moved to industrial centers. We turned economic depression into economic transformation. Klaus pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. And Germany? Germany mobilized efficiently, but within fixed parameters. You maximized the utilization of existing resources without expanding the resource base itself. It's the difference between tuning an engine to peak performance and building a larger engine. The metaphor was painfully apt. Klaus had watched German commanders perform miracles with inadequate supplies, had seen his own men accomplish impossible objectives through superior training and tactical brilliance. But they'd been tuning engines while America built aircraft carriers. "There's something else you should understand, General." Patterson's voice carried a note of finality. "Everything I've told you about American production represents 1943 numbers. Our industrial expansion is still accelerating. By war's end, we'll be producing at levels that will make these figures seem conservative." Klaus stared out the dining room window at the American countryside, where electric lights twinkled in farmhouse windows and freight trains carried their endless loads of manufactured goods. The sound of that distant tank factory seemed louder now, a rhythmic hammering that spoke of unstoppable momentum. "When did you know?" he asked quietly. "When did American leadership understand that you'd already won this war?" Patterson considered the question carefully. "I think the moment came in early 1942 when we realized that American production was exceeding our most optimistic projections, while German production was falling short of their minimum requirements. It became a mathematical certainty. Everything since then has been a matter of execution." Mathematical certainty. The phrase echoed in Klaus's mind as he returned to his quarters that evening. Not hope, not propaganda, not wishful thinking. Mathematical certainty based on production figures, resource allocation, and industrial capacity that operated according to principles he was only beginning to understand. He sat at his desk and began composing a letter to his wife in Munich, knowing the censors would read every word, but needing to put his thoughts in order. How could he explain what he'd learned without sounding like he'd lost his mind? How could he describe an industrial capacity so vast that it defied every assumption about modern warfare? Instead, he wrote about the weather, about the food, about his hopes for a quick end to the war. But between the lines, his engineering mind was already beginning to work through the implications of what he'd discovered. If American production figures were accurate, if their industrial expansion was continuing to accelerate, if their resource base was as deep as Patterson suggested, then Germany wasn't just losing the war, Germany had already lost the war. The realization should have brought despair, but instead, Klaus found himself feeling something unexpected: professional curiosity. How had they done it? How had America transformed a peacetime economy into a wartime industrial machine without the painful transitions that had characterized German mobilization? What organizational principles, what technological innovations, what economic theories had enabled such unprecedented expansion? 3 days after his dinner with Colonel Patterson, Klaus was summoned for formal interrogation. He'd expected this, of course. Intelligence officers would want to debrief him about German armored capabilities, tactical doctrines, and strategic planning. What he hadn't expected was Major Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American intelligence officer whose German was flawless and whose understanding of armored warfare was disturbingly comprehensive. "General von Steinberg," she said,
indicating a chair across from a simple wooden table in what appeared to be a comfortable office rather than an interrogation room. "Thank you for meeting with me. I'm Major Chen, Army Intelligence. I'd like to discuss your experiences with the Africa Corps, particularly regarding equipment reliability and logistical challenges." Klaus studied her carefully. Asian features, American uniform, perfect German pronunciation with a slight Bavarian accent that suggested formal academic training rather than conversational learning. Another impossible contradiction in a country that seemed to specialize in them. "Major Chen, your German is excellent. May I ask where you acquired such fluency?" "University of California, Berkeley. PhD in German literature with a specialization in technical translation. Before the war, I was working on industrial documentation for German machine tool imports." She opened a file folder with what appeared to be comprehensive notes. "I understand you have an engineering background, so you'll appreciate precision in our discussion." "Indeed." Klaus settled into his chair, recognizing that this would be unlike any military debriefing he'd experienced. "What specific information are you seeking?" "Let's start with something straightforward. Your assessment of Panzer IV reliability during extended operations in North African conditions." Klaus considered his response carefully. Equipment reliability was technical information rather than strategic intelligence, and discussing it might provide insights into American manufacturing capabilities. The Panzer IV proved reasonably robust, though desert conditions created challenges we hadn't anticipated during European operations. Sand infiltration caused significant problems with transmission assemblies and final drives.
Major Chen made precise notes, then consulted what appeared to be a technical manual. "Our intelligence suggests that German tanks require major maintenance after approximately 150 operational hours in desert conditions. Would you consider that assessment accurate?" "Approximately, yes, though major maintenance encompasses a range of issues, from track replacement to engine overhauls." "And during your final months in Tunisia, how frequently were you able to perform such maintenance?" The question cut directly to the heart of German logistical collapse, but Klaus saw no point in avoiding the obvious. "Rarely. Spare parts became increasingly scarce after early 1943. We found ourselves cannibalizing non-operational vehicles to maintain a smaller number of combat-effective units." Major Chen nodded, making additional notes. "Would you estimate that more than half of your armored losses were due to mechanical breakdown rather than enemy action?" Klaus hesitated. The admission was embarrassing from a professional standpoint, but it was also probably obvious to anyone who'd studied German operations in North Africa. "By the final phase of operations, yes. We were experiencing catastrophic failure rates that made sustained offensive operations impossible." Now, I'd like to show you something that might interest you from an engineering perspective. Major Chen produced a thick manual bound in heavy cardboard. This is the maintenance manual for the American M4 Sherman tank. Would you mind examining the recommended maintenance intervals? Klaus accepted the manual, immediately noting its production quality. Heavy paper, clear printing, detailed technical illustrations that showed manufacturing precision he associated with German engineering standards. As he read through the specifications, his professional interest overcame his caution. "These maintenance intervals are optimistic," he said finally. 300 hours before major engine maintenance, 500 hours for transmission overhaul. In practice, I would expect significantly shorter intervals, particularly under combat conditions. "And yet," Major Chen said, consulting another document, "field reports from Sherman units in Sicily and southern Italy indicate that we're meeting or exceeding those specifications. Some units report operational hours exceeding 600 before requiring major maintenance."
Klaus looked up from the manual, startled. That would suggest manufacturing tolerances and metallurgical quality significantly superior to our own experience. Or different design philosophies. German engineering tends toward precision optimization, building equipment to exact specifications for maximum theoretical performance. American engineering tends toward robust standardization, building equipment that performs adequately under a wide range of conditions with minimal specialized maintenance. The observation was astute and somewhat insulting, but Klaus recognized its accuracy. German tanks were marvels of engineering precision that required skilled mechanics and high-quality spare parts. American tanks, from what he'd observed, were designed for mass production and field maintenance by relatively unskilled personnel. There's a philosophical question embedded in that distinction, he said carefully, which is whether it's preferable to build one exceptional machine or 10 adequate machines. Major Chen smiled, the first time her professional demeanor had cracked. And what's your assessment of that question based on your combat experience?
Klaus closed the maintenance manual, understanding that he was walking into a trap but unable to resist the intellectual challenge. 10 adequate machines will defeat one exceptional machine, assuming adequate crew training and logistical support. Which brings us to the interesting question of how America is managing to produce adequate machines at exceptional scale while maintaining quality standards that exceed German specifications. There it was, the central puzzle that had been eating at Klaus since his arrival. American production numbers that seemed impossible, quality standards that contradicted mass production principles, and logistical capabilities that suggested resources beyond anything he'd experienced. "How are you doing it?" he asked bluntly. Major Chen leaned back in her chair, apparently considering how much to reveal. "General, you're asking about industrial organization principles that represent several decades of American innovation in manufacturing efficiency. Have you heard of the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant?" "Naturally. Ford's assembly line techniques revolutionized automobile production." River Rouge was designed as a vertically integrated manufacturing complex. Raw materials enter at one end, finished automobiles exit at the other, with minimal transportation and handling between production stages. It was the most efficient manufacturing facility in the world when it was completed in 1928. Klaus nodded, unsure where the lesson was leading. "We've applied similar principles to weapons production, but with one crucial innovation. Instead of building single massive facilities, we've created distributed manufacturing networks that combine the efficiency of vertical integration with the resilience of decentralized production." "I'm afraid I don't follow." Major Chen opened another folder and produced what appeared to be an organizational chart showing dozens of interconnected facilities. "American tank production doesn't happen in single factories. Sherman hulls are manufactured at Detroit Tank Arsenal, turrets at Pressed Steel Car Company, engines at Ford Motor Company, transmissions at Fisher Body Division, final assembly at Lima Locomotive Works. Each facility specializes in components that match their existing manufacturing capabilities." Klaus studied the chart, his engineering mind beginning to grasp the implications. "You're utilizing existing industrial infrastructure rather than building specialized military production facilities." "Exactly. American peacetime industry already possessed the machine tools, skilled labor, and supply chain relationships necessary for complex manufacturing. We didn't need to build tank factories. We needed to adapt existing facilities to tank production while simultaneously expanding overall manufacturing capacity." The elegance of the approach was staggering. Germany had constructed dedicated weapons factories, requiring massive capital investment, specialized equipment, and workers trained from scratch. America had distributed weapons production across existing industrial infrastructure, leveraging established expertise and supply relationships while maintaining civilian production capacity. But coordination must be incredibly complex, Klaus protested. Quality control, delivery schedules, component compatibility across multiple suppliers? Which brings us to another American innovation, statistical quality control and standardized component specifications. Major Chen produced another manual, this one dealing with manufacturing tolerances and inspection procedures. Every component is manufactured to identical specifications, regardless of which facility produces it. A Sherman transmission from Ford will fit perfectly into a hull from Detroit Tank Arsenal because both are manufactured to the same dimensional standards.
Klaus examined the quality control documentation with growing amazement. The level of precision specified exceeded German standards, but the inspection procedures seemed designed for mass production rather than custom manufacturing. American industry had somehow achieved artisan-level precision through industrial-scale processes. How many tanks did you say America produced last year? 24,997, not including self-propelled artillery and specialized vehicles. Klaus did quick mental calculations, applying his understanding of German manufacturing capabilities to the numbers Major Chen had provided. To achieve those production levels with traditional manufacturing methods would require, it's impossible. The machine tool requirements alone would exceed global capacity. Unless you're not using traditional manufacturing methods. General, American industry spent the 1930s developing what we call mass production techniques, manufacturing processes designed for high-volume, standardized production. When we needed to produce tanks, we didn't adapt tank production to our existing capabilities. We adapted our existing capabilities to tank production. The distinction was crucial, and Klaus felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. German industry had tried to scale up precision manufacturing, maintaining quality through skilled craftsmanship and careful attention to detail. American industry had redesigned the manufacturing process itself, creating systems that produced quality through consistent procedures rather than individual skill. And this approach works with complex military equipment? It works better with complex military equipment because complexity requires standardization. When you're coordinating production across dozens of facilities, component interchangeability isn't just convenient, it's essential for maintaining quality and delivery schedules. Klaus sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications. America hadn't just mobilized for war, America had revolutionized the fundamental principles of industrial production, creating manufacturing capabilities that operated according to entirely different rules than anything he'd experienced. Major Chen, may I ask a personal question? Of course. Do you believe Germany ever had a realistic chance of winning this war? She considered the question seriously, consulting her notes as if the answer might be found in production statistics and technical specifications. General, based on my analysis of comparative industrial capabilities, I believe the war was decided the moment America entered it with full commitment to unconditional surrender. Everything since then has been a matter of execution. There was that phrase again. Mathematical certainty based on industrial capacity. Klaus was beginning to understand that he'd been fighting a war that was lost not through tactical failures or strategic mistakes, but through fundamental misunderstanding of what modern warfare required. One final question, if I may. These production levels you've described, are they sustainable?
Major Chen smiled again, but this time her expression carried something that might have been pity. General, everything I've told you represents current production levels. American industrial capacity is still expanding. By 1944, we expect to be producing significantly more than we are today. That evening, Klaus sat at his desk, attempting to compose a letter to his wife, Martha, knowing that every word would be scrutinized by censors. but needing to communicate something of what he'd learned. How could he explain that Germany was fighting an enemy whose industrial capabilities operated according to principles that rendered traditional strategic thinking obsolete? My dear Martha, I hope this letter finds you and the children in good health. Life here continues to be more comfortable than I had expected, and I'm grateful for the humane treatment we receive from our captors. The American officers are professional and courteous, and I find myself engaged in interesting technical discussions about engineering and manufacturing processes. You know how fascinated I've always been by industrial innovation, and I must admit that American manufacturing techniques represent developments I hadn't fully appreciated before my capture. Their approach to large-scale production differs significantly from our traditional methods, with results that challenge many assumptions about the relationship between quality and quantity. I find myself thinking often of our conversations before the war about the future of industrial organization. Do you remember our discussions about Ford's assembly line innovations and whether such techniques could be applied beyond automobile production? It appears that American industry has answered that question in ways I'm still working to understand. Klaus paused, knowing that he was approaching the boundaries of what censors would allow. How could he tell Martha that Germany was losing not just battles, but the fundamental industrial war that determined modern conflict? How could he explain that American production capabilities made German mobilization look like a peacetime hobby project? Please give my love to Klaus Jr. and Maria. I hope Klaus is continuing his studies in mathematics and engineering. Such skills will be essential in the world that emerges from this conflict. Technical education has become more important than I realized when I was his age, and I regret not emphasizing its significance more strongly in our conversations. I think often about our discussions regarding Germany's industrial development and the challenges of competing with more established manufacturing nations. Recent conversations here have given me new perspectives on those questions, though I lack the context to draw definitive conclusions about their implications. He set down his pen, frustrated by the need to communicate in code, knowing that Martha would read between the lines, but uncertain whether she would understand the magnitude of what he was learning. The letter felt inadequate, a weak shadow of the industrial revelation that was reshaping his understanding of the war. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Lieutenant Morrison entered carrying what appeared to be several newspapers and magazines. "General, Colonel Patterson thought you might be interested in some current American publications. They're already several weeks old, so there are no security concerns about their content." Klaus accepted the materials gratefully. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I confess I'm curious about how American media is covering the war."
These particular issues were selected because they contain articles about industrial production that might interest someone with your engineering background. Morrison paused at the door. "Colonel Patterson mentioned that you've been asking questions about American manufacturing capabilities." After Morrison left, Klaus spread the publications across his desk, immediately noting their quality. Heavy paper, clear printing, color photographs that spoke of abundant resources and sophisticated production processes. Even the advertisements were revelatory. Consumer goods that remained available despite wartime conditions. Luxury items that suggested civilian manufacturing had been maintained alongside military production. The first article that caught his attention was titled "Detroit's War Production Miracle," with photographs of aircraft assembly lines that stretched beyond the camera's ability to capture their full extent. Workers, many of them women, operated sophisticated machinery with the kind of casual competence that suggested extensive training and reliable equipment. Ford's Willow Run plant produces one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes around the clock. The facility, larger than many American cities, employs 42,000 workers operating in 3 shifts 7 days per week.
Production lines designed using advanced industrial engineering techniques maintain quality standards that exceed pre-war specifications while achieving unprecedented manufacturing speed. Klaus stared at the photographs, trying to comprehend the scale of operations they represented. One bomber every 63 minutes, 42,000 workers in a single facility. Production lines designed for speed and quality simultaneously. The numbers challenged everything he understood about manufacturing limitations. Another article focused on shipbuilding, with photographs of Liberty ships under construction in yards that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The caption indicated that American shipyards were launching new vessels faster than Germany could sink them, with production schedules that treated 10,000-ton cargo ships as standardized commodities rather than complex engineering projects. Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, recently launched the Robert E. Peary just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after laying her keel, establishing a new world record for ship construction speed. The achievement demonstrates American industry's mastery of prefabrication techniques and assembly line shipbuilding that treats vessels as manufactured products rather than individually crafted constructions. 4 days to build a 10,000-ton ship. Klaus had witnessed German shipyard operations where such vessels required months of careful construction, with skilled craftsmen handling every aspect of assembly. American industry had industrialized shipbuilding itself, treating complex vessels as mass-produced commodities. But it was the third article that truly staggered him. Titled America's Production Revolution, it contained production statistics that seemed impossible even after his conversations with Colonel Patterson and Major Chen. American industrial output in 1943 exceeded the combined production of all Axis powers, despite the United States maintaining higher civilian consumption levels than any combatant nation. Aircraft production reached 86,329 units, including 9,615 heavy bombers, 23,988 fighter aircraft, and 52,726 transport and training aircraft. Tank production totaled 29,497 units, while artillery production exceeded 37,000 pieces. Klaus read the statistics 3 times, checking his translation, trying to find some error that would make the numbers comprehensible. 86,000 aircraft in a single year, 29,000 tanks, 37,000 artillery pieces. Production levels that exceeded the total manufacturing capacity of Europe combined. And civilian consumption was higher than before the war. He turned to the next page where a chart showed American production trends from 1940 to 1943. The curves weren't linear, they were exponential, showing acceleration that suggested American industry was still far from peak capacity. Steel production had tripled, aluminum production had increased by a factor of 6, shipbuilding had expanded by over 1,000%.
At the bottom of the page, a small sidebar contained a quote from Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board. American industry has demonstrated that the traditional relationship between wartime production and civilian sacrifice represents outdated thinking about industrial organization. We are proving that a properly mobilized economy can expand military production while simultaneously improving civilian living standards. Klaus set the magazine aside, his hands trembling slightly. He walked to his window and stared out at the Ohio countryside, where the distant hammering of the tank factory continued its relentless rhythm. Each strike of the machinery seemed to echo with the weight of inevitability. Over the following weeks,
Klaus found himself drawn into deeper conversations with his fellow prisoners. The camp held over 3,000 German officers, representing every branch of the Wehrmacht and virtually every theater of operations. Their collective experiences painted a picture that individual perspectives had obscured. Hauptmann Weber, still bitter about his lost arm, had commanded artillery in Russia. The Americans gave the Soviets trucks, he told Klaus during one of their evening walks around the camp perimeter. Hundreds of thousands of trucks, Studebakers, Dodges, Fords, better than anything we ever built, and they gave them away like party favors. Oberst Heinrich Müller, a Luftwaffe pilot who'd been shot down over Sicily, added his own perspective. American pilot training programs are graduating 10,000 new aviators per month. Per month, Klaus. We're lucky to train 500. And their aircraft. He shook his head in frustrated admiration. They don't just replace losses, they expand their squadrons while simultaneously improving aircraft performance. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle Klaus was struggling to solve. Germany hadn't just underestimated American industrial capacity, Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare itself. The revelation came during a lecture series the camp organized for prisoner education. Professor James Morton, an economist from Ohio State University, had been invited to speak on industrial organization in modern warfare. Klaus attended expecting academic theory. Instead, he encountered analysis that reframed everything he thought he understood about the conflict. "Gentlemen," Professor Morton began, addressing the assembled German officers with respectful directness, "you've been participants in history's first truly industrial war. Not a war that uses industrial products, but a war where industrial capacity itself determines outcomes. The nation that can produce more, distribute more efficiently, and innovate more rapidly will achieve victory regardless of tactical brilliance or strategic planning." The professor displayed charts showing comparative production figures that made Klaus's previous conversations seem conservative. American steel production was approaching 90 million tons annually, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Aluminum production exceeded global pre-war output by a factor of 5. Synthetic rubber production had eliminated what should have been a critical strategic vulnerability.
A panzer commander from Klaus's division raised his hand. "Professor, these techniques you describe, why weren't they developed in Germany? Our engineering expertise equals or exceeds American capabilities." Morton nodded thoughtfully. "An excellent question, Major. German engineering excels at precision optimization, building exceptional individual machines through superior craftsmanship and attention to detail. American engineering excels at systematic optimization, building adequate machines through superior processes and organizational efficiency. The war has demonstrated that systematic optimization scales more effectively than precision optimization." Klaus found himself standing without conscious decision. "Professor, you're suggesting that German industrial philosophy was fundamentally flawed, not just inadequately applied." "I'm suggesting that industrial philosophy determines wartime capabilities more than most military planners realize. Germany organized for a short war, requiring maximum performance from limited resources. America organized for a long war, requiring sustained production from expandable resources. The moment this became a war of attrition, the outcome was predetermined." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Klaus looked around the lecture hall at his fellow officers, men who had fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill, who had won impossible victories against overwhelming odds, who had maintained military discipline under conditions that would have broken lesser armies. All of it had been meaningless because they were fighting the wrong war against an enemy they didn't understand. 3 months into his captivity, Klaus received a letter from Martha that changed his perspective once again. The censors had allowed it through, perhaps because its content seemed too personal to contain strategic information. My dearest Klaus, your letters have been such a comfort, though I don't always understand your technical discussions about manufacturing and industrial organization. Life here in Munich has become very difficult. Food rationing grows more severe each month, and coal for heating is nearly impossible to obtain. The children are healthy, but Klaus Jr. has had to suspend his studies because the university has been converted to war production. I must tell you something that may be difficult to hear. Heinrich Zimmermann returned from the Eastern Front last week. He lost both legs to a Soviet mine, but he's alive. He told me things about our situation that I hadn't understood before. The bombing has become constant, Klaus. Not just military targets, but entire city districts. They say the Americans and British can send 1,000 bombers in a single raid now as regularly as postal deliveries. But that's not what troubles me most. Heinrich says our boys on the Eastern Front are fighting with equipment that is falling apart, that ammunition is rationed, that entire divisions lack proper winter clothing. Meanwhile, he says, the Soviets have American trucks, American radios, American weapons, all in quantities that seem impossible. Klaus, I'm beginning to wonder if the reports we hear about German victories are complete truths. If America can supply Russia with unlimited equipment while simultaneously fighting in Italy and preparing for invasion of France, what chance do we really have? I know you can't answer such questions directly, but your letters about industrial capacity have made me think about our situation differently. The children ask about you constantly. I tell them you're safe and that you'll return when this war ends. But Klaus, I find myself hoping this war ends soon, regardless of the terms. I no longer believe victory is possible, and I fear what defeat may cost us if we continue fighting. All my love, Martha. Klaus read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new depths of despair. Martha was describing the collapse of German civilian morale, the breakdown of supply systems that once seemed adequate, the growing recognition that continued resistance meant prolonged suffering without hope of victory. But her reference to Heinrich Zimmermann triggered a memory that sent Klaus hurrying to the camp library. Among the American newspapers and magazines, he found back issues from 1941 and 1942 containing reports about something called Lend-Lease, that he'd dismissed this propaganda when he'd first encountered references to it. The reality was staggering. America wasn't just fighting Germany directly, America was simultaneously equipping Britain, Russia, China, and dozens of smaller allies with military equipment that exceeded their domestic production capacity. Soviet tank production was formidable, but American tanks, trucks, aircraft, and supplies were enabling Soviet offensives that German intelligence had attributed entirely to Russian industrial recovery.
Klaus found detailed statistics that made his head swim. Since 1941, America had provided the Soviet Union with 400,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of food, fuel, and raw materials. Britain had received similar quantities, while American forces were simultaneously expanding across multiple theaters with equipment that seemed inexhaustible. The full scope of American industrial dominance became clear. This wasn't a two-front war for Germany. This was a war against American industrial capacity distributed across dozens of allies, each supplied with equipment that exceeded what Germany could produce for its own forces. Klaus's transformation reached completion during a conversation with Colonel Patterson 6 months into his captivity. Spring had arrived in Ohio, and the camp's gardens were blooming with vegetables grown by prisoners who were beginning to accept that their stay might be permanent. "General," Patterson said as they walked among the tomato plants, "I've been reading your letters to your wife.
The sensors share interesting correspondence with me sometimes." Klaus tensed, uncertain what breach of security he might have committed. "Don't worry, you've been entirely proper. But I notice you've been struggling with questions about why this war developed as it has. May I offer you an American perspective?" "Please." Patterson paused beside a fence post, looking out toward the tank factory whose noise had become background music to their daily lives. Germany made the mistake of assuming that warfare in the 1940s would resemble warfare in the 1910s, that victory would come through superior tactics, better training, and more efficient use of limited resources. American leadership understood that warfare in the 1940s would be fundamentally different, that victory would come through superior production, better logistics, and virtually unlimited resources applied systematically. But how did American leadership reach that understanding when German leadership did not? Because American leadership was drawn largely from business and industry rather than traditional military backgrounds. Men like Donald Nelson, William Knudsen, and Henry Kaiser brought industrial management experience to strategic planning. They approached warfare as a production problem rather than a tactical problem. Klaus considered this. "You're suggesting that America's advantage came from civilian expertise rather than military expertise. I'm suggesting that modern warfare requires both, but civilian expertise becomes decisive when conflicts extend beyond quick tactical victories. Germany organized for blitzkrieg, rapid campaigns decided by tactical superiority and operational excellence. America organized for industrial warfare, sustained campaigns decided by production capacity and logistical supremacy. And when blitzkrieg failed to achieve quick victory, the war became a contest of industrial capacity, which America was always going to win. Not because American soldiers were better fighters, but because American industry could equip more soldiers with better equipment more consistently than any other nation on Earth." Klaus stared at the distant factory, finally understanding the sound that had haunted him since his arrival. It wasn't just tank production. It was the sound of systematic victory, industrial supremacy applied with relentless efficiency to military objectives. Klaus remained at Camp Perry until May 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached the prisoners through official channels. The announcement came without surprise. Most of the German officers had accepted the inevitable months earlier, as letters from home described conditions that made continued resistance obviously futile. The repatriation process took another year, during which Klaus participated in a program that American intelligence called re-education, but which felt more like advanced industrial training. He learned about American manufacturing techniques, studied production management systems, and gained insights into organizational principles that would prove invaluable in post-war reconstruction. When he finally returned to Munich in the spring of 1946, Klaus found a city devastated by bombing, but already showing signs of recovery under American occupation. The same industrial principles that had won the war were being applied to reconstruction efforts, with results that exceeded what he'd thought possible. Martha met him at the train station, older and thinner, but alive. Klaus Jr. and Maria had grown into teenagers who barely remembered their father, but who were eager to hear about America and the technical marvels he'd observed during his captivity. "What was it like?" Martha asked, as they walked through the rubble-strewn streets toward their partially destroyed home. Klaus considered the question carefully. How could he explain that his captivity had been an education in possibilities he'd never imagined? How could he describe an industrial capacity so vast that it had simultaneously defeated multiple enemies while improving civilian living standards? "It was like seeing the future," he said finally, "and understanding that we had been fighting the past." Klaus returned to his engineering career, but with perspectives that transformed his approach to industrial organization. He became one of the architects of West Germany's economic miracle, applying mass production techniques to European precision manufacturing, creating hybrid systems that combined the best of both approaches. Years later, when colleagues asked about his wartime experiences, Klaus would tell them about the sound of that Ohio tank factory, the rhythmic hammering that represented not just military production, but a new way of thinking about human organization, resource allocation, and the systematic application of industrial capacity to national objectives. The Americans didn't just win the war, he would say. They redefined what it means to win. They showed that properly organized industrial democracy could outproduce totalitarian efficiency, that free societies could mobilize more effectively than authoritarian states, and that the future belonged to nations that understood technology as a tool for human flourishing rather than human domination. The arsenal of democracy had proven its point, not through superior weapons or better tactics, but through superior organization and unlimited commitment to industrial production that served human purposes rather than merely military ones. In the end, that may have been the most important lesson of all.
Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the arsenal of democracy. This story of Klaus von Steinberg's transformation from German general to witness of American industrial might represents one of the most fascinating aspects of World War II. How the conflict was ultimately decided not just on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines across America's heartland. If this story captivated you as much as it did me while researching and writing it, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with friends who appreciate detailed historical fiction. Stories like this take weeks of research and careful crafting to bring you the most authentic and engaging content possible. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest historical narratives. We're constantly working on new stories that explore the human side of history's most pivotal moments, from the perspectives of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. What aspect of this story resonated most with you? The industrial revelations? Klaus's personal transformation? Or the broader questions about how societies organize for conflict? Let me know in the comments below. Your feedback helps guide our future storytelling. Until next time, remember that history's most important lessons often come not from the grand strategies of leaders, but from the daily experiences of people trying to understand a world being transformed around them. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story. The Arsenal of Democracy, a German General's Awakening.